I will, even though that is not typical and I don't like it, I will read my text so that I'll be, faithful with the time. So, are Orthodox churches particularly prone to nationalization and even to nationalism? I'm borrowing the title of my paper from an article written by Vasilios Makridis, a Greek sociologist who lives and teaches in Germany. The original title of his article was, "Why are Orthodox churches particularly prone to nationalization and even to nationalism?" We prefer, however, for the purposes of our paper, to rephrase it as an open question. Are Orthodox churches particularly prone to nationalization and even to nationalism? Before we continue, let me clarify that in our analysis, we define nationalism as a sense of moral superiority over outsiders and as a doctrine of special destiny that, despite all the obstacles, will one day be actualized. Now, I think we have heard Mikey talk a little bit about that, but I think it's very important to define what do we mean when we say nationalism. So this is an idea that has been evolved. So at the beginning of the 19th century, it was a good thing. It was, getting away from the three big empires, getting your country, and it was all about liberation. So it was the introduction to modernity, the world as we know it today. But then there is this idea that my nation is almost a sacred religion, as also we have heard. So that there is a destiny, there is a sense of being chosen, election, and all these notions was very religious. So when we talk about nationalism, we have a negative connotation here, all right? So I just wanted to clarify that. So it creates nationalism and imagined community. This is a well-known phrase on the issue of nationalism, coined by a guy by the name Benedict Anderson, who has a book with this title. You have perhaps remembered that the title of Maria Todorova's book was Imagining the Balkans. So this is the same connotation. So she is inspired by that. So what is nationalism? It creates an imagined community, but the formation of a community entails the exclusion of those who don't meet the criteria for the inclusion in it, okay? So by definition, nationalism creates the other. So it's against the other, us against the other. The other either is seen in a diminished way or as a threat. So that is, how we define that. So we have insiders and outsiders at best, and insiders and enemies at worst. So we return to our question. Are Orthodox churches particularly prone to nationalism? The answer is both very simple and extremely complex. So if the question is whether they are prone to nationalism, the answer is yes. It is obvious to all of us who live in the Balkans, and particularly in Orthodox majority countries, that there is a clear tendency towards nationalism to all Orthodox churches in every country without exception. Are, however, particularly prone. Here is where the complexity begins. In our paper, we're going to present two alternative ways to answer this question. We'll examine first the negative answer to this question given by Paschalis Kytromilidis, a prominent Greek professor of political science and member of the Athens Academy. Then we will proceed to the positive answer of Vasilios Makridis. At the end, we will try to make some basic observations, and being a pastor, I cannot avoid concluding with some practical suggestions. So first, the ecumenical spirit of the orthodoxy and the deviation of nationalism. In his book, Religion and Politics in the Orthodox World, Kytromilidis gives us a narrative. It's very interesting that all along we talk about narratives and myths. He gives us a narrative in which you have the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good in the story is the ecumenical patriarchate of Constantinople. The church, with capital C, is in an ecumenical institution, which at the end of the 19th century was subjected, that's his term, to the modern secular Balkan states and their ambitions and goals. These newly formed Balkan states are the bad ones of the story. So you have the ecumenical spirit of the patriarchate, and then you have all these national ambitions, what, they subject the church to their own ideologies. So who is the bad of the story? The Balkan nations. Thus, there is a transition for the church from an institution of the Orthodox Christian community under Ottoman rule to its status as a national church in the late 20th century. These new state or national churches are the ugly. For him, the ecumenical patriarchate epitomizes the true spirit of orthodoxy. In that sense, nationalism cannot be intrinsic, that's his term, to the church, which is by its constitution ecumenical, but a deviation from her true spirit. According to this narrative, the church, in the context of the Ottoman Empire, remained devoid, we just heard about that, the millet, remained devoid of ethnic and national connotations, maintaining a dual role, providing pastoral care to its flock and political representation of the Christians, regardless nationality, to the Sublime Porte, to the Sultan. With regards to the first, its main concern was the cohesion of the Christian population. The role of the ecumenical patriarchate was to unite, and that's his quotation, under its pastoral care, the multilingual Orthodox population of the Balkans and Asia Minor within the Ottoman Empire, and also the dense network of Orthodox diaspora communities in Italy, Central and Western Europe and Russia. The other role of the church was to represent the Christian population and guarantee its loyalty to the empire, to pay the taxes. The multinational and ecumenical spirit was demolished with the rise of the national states, end of 19th, beginning of 20th century. They used the church for their ideological purposes, and the church used them in order to solidify its power or to protect herself from the threats of proselytism. Against the bad guy at the end are the Protestant missionaries. So this is, again, Kitromili, this is that, they needed the protection of this. So they were willing to give away, to play the role that the state wanted them to play, so that the state will give them. So think about modern day Russia and, this, the dealings with the church there. So the church, as Kitromilidis observes, readily collaborated with this project, the nationalization of the new states, enjoying the support of state mechanisms that cemented its now authority. Perhaps we should talk about the good, the bad, and the willing. Is this, however, an accurate narrative? I'm not going to get into that. You will find in the paper. There are many historians and scholars who really doubt whether the millet was actually a multicultural with no ethnic connotations. Many scholars argue that at the very core of the millet, it was a Hellenic, it was a Greek. Again, there was an ethnic element there, which was the Greek ethnicity. And that is important because it helps us understand a very important synod that took place in Constantinople in the 1872, which I think is very important to keep in mind when we talk about nationalism. It's a synod where the church, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the synod of the Orthodox Church, condemned ethnophyletichism as an ecclesiastical heresy. Of course, we really admire that and we say, wow, 1872, a condemnation of nationalists, but in reality, it was the Bulgarian, it was when the Patriarch of Constantinople realized that the Bulgarians, they want to start an exarchy, meaning an independent church, they gathered this synod to condemn that, and of course, in this synod, no Slavic church participated. So again, it was protecting the Greek identity of the church against Slavic I mean, history repeats itself over and over again. So even though many people, even the Pan-Orthodox Synod that took place in Crete, they made a reference to that. I think it's very important to put it in our historical context. Now, let's move. So this is one narrative. It's a very convenient narrative. You had this ecumenical spirit, and then the bad guys are the nations, that they subject the church into their agendas, and the poor church, they decide to do that, but, this is a deviation, and so that is one narrative. So they are not prone to nationalism. That would be Ketromilidis' answer. Now, let's move to examine another answer to that question. We'll go to Makridis now. The intrinsic proneness of the Orthodox Church to nationalism. Makridis' main point is that besides the exogenous and circumstantial factors which contributed to the affinity of Orthodoxy to nationalism, there are also several intrinsic ones. A first contributive factor is what he calls the historical closeness between church and state and its modern transformation. The Byzantine notion of symphony, and the consensual relationship or consensual arrangement, synallelia, between the emperor and the patriarch provided the context and the theopolitical paradigm for the formulation of the new political theory that was formed with the emergence of modern nations. Now, that's very interesting. In the West, on the contrary, the articulation of church-state relations was characterized by their tension and conflict. This is the Augustinian tradition. In other words, the traditional relationship between the emperor and the patriarch, the throne and the altar, as Lipovats, another Greek scholar, describes it, was transformed, which took place in the East, was transformed in the close embrace between the church and the nation. Of course, that doesn't mean that this modern relationship is the exact replica of the old paradigm. I believe that this is a very important thing to underline when we try to think, why in the Orthodox world we see nationalism as a phenomenon. It has to do with the two very different political theologies which were developed in the West and the East. It is a difference between Augustine and Eusebius, between an emphasis on the tension between the city of God and the city of man on the one hand. If we read, we are finishing, some of us, a year-long project of reading the city of God by Augustine. So there you see the tension, the distinction between the city of, the emperor and the patriarch, so to say, the church and the state. Whereas in Eusebius, the emperor is God's means in order to Christianize the empire. Okay, so you see, and of course that has to do with this whole notion of grace and nature, that grace permeates nature, so in a way, you see a fusion. I mean, in the West you see a tension, in the East you see a fusion between, the emperor and, so the emperor is an earthly priest, Eusebius would say, which brings about the truth of God to his subjects, Christianizing the society. So I think that is a very important point. A second factor is the pluralistic church structures and the criteria for church autocephaly and autonomy. We continue with Makridis' analysis. Contrary to the West, in the Orthodox East, there was an administrative plurality lacking a single unified center of power like Vatican. Thus, in the East, there is a plurality of administrative and spiritual centers. Initially, the autonomy of these centers was not based on ethnic or national criteria. The structure, however, was already there. So with the rise of nationalism, there was simply a transformation of the nature of this plurality. Patriarch Bartholomew, our recent patriarch, has aptly summarized this long process as follows. While the original system of the Pentarchy, the 5 patriarchs, emanated from respect for the apostolicity and particularity of the traditions of these ancient patriarchies, the autocephaly of later churches grew out of respect for the cultural identity of nations. Moreover, the overall system of autocephaly was encroached in recent years through secular influences by the spirit of ethnophyletism or still worse of state nationalism. A third factor is the missiological strategy of the Orthodox Church. The way Eastern Christianity was established among many Christianized people through missionary work was characterized by ethnogenesis and, two difficult words for me, indigenization and vernacularization, meaning Cyril and Methodius, okay, will give you an alphabet and will translate the Bible in your own language and all of that. So that is Makridis' understanding. So a final factor is the interconnection between church people and homeland. The Byzantines considered themselves to be the new elect people of God. Their self-understanding was connected with a particular vision of history and the role of the elect people in it. A single and unified Orthodox population or nation living in such a territory is the ideal situation. Now, that's his analysis. It is interesting that all these factors that Makridis identifies, taking in and of themselves, are neither negative nor problematic. They're neutral and in some cases even positive. For example, the plurality of spiritual centers can be seen from a Protestant perspective as something positive, that there is no Pope or Vatican. Same with the missiological strategy. It is interesting, therefore, to observe that sometimes there are some unintended consequences of good things. So, are Orthodox churches particularly prone to nationalism? I believe that we need a better question. So let me rephrase it once more. Are Orthodox churches prone to nationalism in a particular way? The answer would be yes. They are not unique in their proneness to nationalism, but they are unique in the way that this proneness is played out. There are many versions of religious nationalism. For example, in the United States, there is this new phenomenon of Christian nationalism, which now is being studied by many sociologists, and there are Catholic versions of nationalism. So religion with nationalism, they're connected, but what is the particular way that nationalism is connected with the Orthodox Church? That is, I think, what we need to figure out. We need to understand, however, our Balkan religious nationalism in its own terms. Trying to summarize both Kytromylidis and Makridis, we can say two basic things that explain Orthodox nationalism in the Balkans. The first is the rise of national states after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of the national identity. We have heard about that many times already. The second is the particular political theology which does not have as its center tension and conflict, but symphonia and fusion between the church and the state. So let me conclude with several observations and then some practical suggestions. Now, both authors help us see the paradox of being anti-Western while you are fully Westernized. Orthodox nationalism, I think that is an interesting point to underline. Orthodox nationalism is expressed pretty often with strong anti-Western rhetoric. The basic core of this anti-Western discourse is that we need to protect the purity and superiority of our national heritage and values against the imported Western influences. Both Kytromylidis and Makridis show us, however, that these zealots curse modernity and the West in their rhetoric, but they remain fundamentally modern because they're motivated by the nationalistic phenomena which are characteristic of Western modernity. I think that is something that we have heard even from Maki's analysis and all of that. So there is a paradox there. This is related, however, to another interesting observation. Our most common perception of the Orthodox Church is to see it as a rigid body unable to adapt and change. Both Kytromylidis and Makridis show us that this is not an absolute case. The whole idea of national churches and autocephaly is a case of a new ecclesiological development fully adjusted to the new ideas coming from the West. So I think that is also another observation. It is interesting to wonder why nationalism in the Orthodox Church is still alive and well today. If the resort to nationalism was circumstantial, that is, if it is explained by the historical constituencies of the end of 19th and beginning of 20th century, then why does it still characterize the Orthodox churches today, 2 centuries after? Even more, how do we explain the same phenomenon in the Orthodox diaspora? For example, in Boston, there was the Serbian bishop, there was the Greek Serbian Orthodox bishop, the Armenian Orthodox bishop, the Greek Orthodox bishop, the Georgian Orthodox bishop, the Ukrainian Orthodox bishop, the Russian Orthodox bishop in the same town. So this is an ecclesiological anomaly for the Orthodox, but also it begs the question, I mean, why is that necessary? Okay, back in the 19th century, it was part of the national myth, creating the national identity. Why in Boston, for example, is important to maintain that? Now, I'm not going to continue. I'm just going to summarize 3 practical suggestions, if, take into consideration this analysis. Unfortunately, the answer to why the Orthodox Church, even today, maintains these nationalistic ideals is because they have been internalized. So sometimes, you follow some other's agenda, but it's very important that after a while that becomes, without even realizing, internalized. So right now, unfortunately, most Orthodox churches, they have lost the eschatological element of the gospel. So, they think about the kingdom of God, establishing the kingdom of God here and now. This is what nationalism is. So most pulpits in Orthodox churches, they see themselves as the ark of the nation. So having that, what are they missing? They're missing the spiritual aspect. So I think, I would agree with Tim, I think it's a mistake to see how can we become more nationalistic or whatever. We are bad Romans. That's fine. That's okay. Because our emphasis would be the church exists and as an eschatological beacon and needs to focus on the spiritual elements, which are totally missing. And there are many people, I believe, that, there are other people who can do the nationalistic work even better than the church, but it's only the church that can provide answer to existential questions. So I think that as evangelicals, we are to focus on that. On the other hand, I think it is very important to admit that we need to, how can I say that? There's this difference between nationalism and nationalization. I think we need to avoid nationalism, but we need to embrace nationalization. Actually, that is what we're trying to do right now. Meaning that many times our churches, let me say it like this, there are many people who visit our church Sunday mornings. And I remember there was once a lady coming from Birmingham, Alabama, out of all places. She attended our service, and then at the end, she told me, "Oh, that was so wonderful. I felt so much at home." And at first, I took that as a compliment. But then as I was pondering, I said, okay, it's what Mikey said, you remember. If this lady from Birmingham, Alabama, this Presbyterian lady from Birmingham, Alabama, comes to our church in the center of Athens and feels at home, that means that our church is not Greek enough. Okay? So that is part of our job. For a long time, we're simply importing ideas, methodology, whatever, theology from the West. I think that we need to start thinking and developing, our own voice and our own outlook. So I will end with that and open it to questions. if there are any questions for that or general comments or whatever, you know, and we'll finish on time, don't worry. I know we're all tired, but